There's a moment in every connection that no one prepares you for, a quiet, almost invisible shift where the energy changes. Nothing dramatic happens on the surface, no loud argument, no final goodbye, just silence, distance, a feeling that something sacred has slipped through your fingers. And if you've ever been the one who always stayed, always tried, always gave more, then you know exactly how heavy that moment feels. But what if the real story isn't about the one who leaves, but about the one who finally stops chasing? What happens when the person who held everything together lets go without warning? What happens when the one who understood you better than anyone becomes emotionally unavailable to you? That's the moment that shakes everything. Because when a deeply empathetic person detaches, it doesn't come from anger, it doesn't come from ego, it comes from awakening. And that's the part most people don't see coming. You see, not all empathy is the same. There are people who care, and then there are those rare individuals who feel everything on a level that goes beyond logic. They don't just hear your words, they feel your silence. They don't just see your actions, they understand your patterns. They can sense the shifts in your energy before you even recognize them yourself. These are the ones who stay longer than they should, the ones who forgive more than they're asked to, the ones who try to love you in ways that heal parts of you that you've hidden from the world. And at first it feels like a blessing to have someone like that in your life. Someone who sees you completely and still chooses you. But what most people don't realize is that this kind of depth comes with a limit, not a weak limit, but a sacred one. Because when someone gives that much of themselves, they're not doing it blindly, they're doing it with awareness, even if they don't act on it right away. And that's where the story begins to change. Because the same person who can love you endlessly is also the one who can walk away with clarity once they've had enough. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that seeks revenge, but in a way that feels almost unreal. One day they're there, holding space for you, understanding you, trying to make it work. And the next, it's like something inside them has gone quiet. No more over-explaining, no more chasing, no more trying to fix what was never theirs to fix. And for someone who was used to their presence, that silence becomes deafening. But to understand why this shift hits so hard, you have to look at the other side of the dynamic. There are people who crave connection, but at the same time feel overwhelmed by it. People who want love but fear losing themselves in it. So they create distance, not always consciously, but as a way to protect themselves. They convince themselves they don't need too much closeness, that independence is safer, that emotions can be managed by keeping people at arm's length. And for a while, this works, especially when they're with someone who's willing to do the emotional work for both of them, someone who fills in the gaps, someone who doesn't demand too much, who understands their need for space, who keeps showing up even when they pull away. But here's the part no one talks about. When you're used to someone always being there, you stop noticing how much they're carrying. You start to believe that their patience is endless, that their understanding is permanent, that no matter how much you withdraw, they'll find their way back to you, and slowly, without even realizing it, a pattern forms. One person leans in, the other steps back. One gives more, the other takes space, and it becomes a cycle that feels normal until it isn't, because the person who gives the most is also the one who feels the most. They notice every inconsistency, every emotional gap, every moment where they're pouring into something that isn't pouring back into them, but they don't always react immediately. They sit with it. They try to understand it. They make excuses for it. They tell themselves that love requires patience, that people need time, that things will change. And for a while they keep going. Not because they're weak, but because they believe in the connection. They believe in what it could be, until one day, something inside them shifts. It's not loud, it's not explosive, it's quiet, almost peaceful, and that's what makes it so powerful, because instead of reacting emotionally, they become still. Instead of chasing, they step back. Instead of trying to fix everything, they start observing everything, and in that space, clarity begins to grow. They start to see the dynamic for what it really is, not what they hoped it would be, not what they tried to turn it into, but what it actually is. And that realization changes everything. Because once someone reaches that level of awareness, they can't unsee it. They can't go back to overgiving. They can't pretend they don't notice the imbalance. They can't keep abandoning themselves just to maintain a connection. So instead of fighting for the relationship, they start choosing themselves, and that's when the detachment begins. Now here's where it gets even deeper. Because from the outside, detachment can look like indifference. It can look like someone suddenly doesn't care anymore, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Real detachment doesn't come from a lack of feeling. It comes from feeling too much for too long, without being met in the same way. It comes from realizing that love shouldn't feel like a constant struggle. That connection shouldn't feel like something you have to earn over and over again. And when that realization settles in, something inside them finally lets go. They stop reacting the way they used to. They stop chasing conversations. They stop trying to pull you closer when you drift away. And for the first time, they match your energy, not as a game, but as a boundary, not to hurt you, but to protect themselves. And that's the moment everything flips. Because the person who was once so available, so present, so understanding, is no longer filling the emotional space the way they used to. And for someone who was used to that, it feels like a loss they can't quite explain. It creates a kind of discomfort that's hard to ignore. Because now, instead of being the one who controls the distance, they're the one feeling it. And that feeling is unfamiliar. It's confusing. It's unsettling. It raises questions that were never asked before. Why aren't they reaching out? Why do they feel so different? Did something change, or did I just not notice before? And the more they sit with that silence, the louder it becomes. Because what they're actually experiencing isn't just distance. It's the absence of someone who once made everything feel safe without demanding anything in return. And that absence has weight. It forces reflection. It creates awareness. It brings up emotions that were easier to avoid when the other person was still trying. Because as long as someone is chasing you, you don't have to confront your own patterns. You don't have to question your behavior. You don't have to look at the role you played in the dynamic. But when that chasing stops, there's nothing left to distract you from yourself, and that's where the real discomfort begins. Because now, it's not about them anymore, it's about you, about the space you created, about the connection you kept at a distance, about the person who stayed until they couldn't anymore. And the hardest part, realizing that they didn't leave because they stopped caring. They left because they finally started caring about themselves. After choosing someone else for so long, the shift that follows isn't just emotional, it's energetic. It's a subtle change that can be felt even without words being spoken. True detachment isn't about cutting someone off in anger, proving a point, or becoming cold. It's much deeper than that. It's the quiet, deliberate decision to stop investing energy where it is no longer valued. It's the realization that love should not demand losing oneself just to keep another person comfortable. When this realization settles in, it doesn't create chaos. It creates stillness. That stillness carries an unusual power. Instead of reacting impulsively, trying to fix every misunderstanding, or closing every emotional gap, the person becomes calm, grounded, and unshaken by things that once triggered them. To someone who was used to their emotional availability, this calm can feel unfamiliar, almost unsettling, because the dynamic they relied on is no longer there. Predictability disappears, tension arises, and the cycle they once controlled begins to unravel. Detachment is often misunderstood. It is not the absence of love, but the presence of self-respect. It is what happens when someone recognizes that their worth is not defined by how much they can endure. It's the moment when the question shifts from "how can I make this work?" to "why am I the only one trying?" And once asked honestly, this question demands an honest answer, often revealing truths that were long avoided. From the other side, this shift can feel like rejection, not because it truly is rejection, but because it removes the comfort of control. When someone is always present, always reaching out, it creates a sense of security, even if unappreciated. But when that presence fades, when messages become less frequent and emotional intensity softens, the environment of predictability collapses, creating a subtle but profound disruption. This disruption triggers deep, often unacknowledged emotions. Now, the person who was once the pursuer experiences distance instead of creating it, which is difficult to process. There is no explosive conflict, no dramatic ending, just a gradual withdrawal. This quiet fading is confusing because it leaves questions unanswered. Did I miss something? Could I have done things differently? Is it too late to repair it? The absence of emotional presence creates internal conflict. On one side is the instinct to maintain control and distance. On the other, a growing awareness that something meaningful is slipping away. This awareness builds slowly, almost imperceptibly, until it can no longer be ignored. Small thoughts emerge. Why haven't they reached out? Why do they seem so different? Why do they appear okay without me? These thoughts create discomfort because they challenge the once comfortable belief that the connection would always remain. With this shift comes unpredictability. Roles change, dynamics are disrupted, and the security of control is gone. This unpredictability is unsettling, creating an urge to reach out, to test the bond, not out of clarity, but out of confusion. The silence left by the person who once chased is louder than any words, and it begins to echo in ways that are hard to ignore. It lingers in quiet moments, showing up when there is no distraction, creating emotional pressure that demands attention. In that silence, reflection begins, not forced, not intentional, but natural. Sitting with the absence of someone who once felt constant brings unresolved feelings and overlooked patterns to the surface. Gradually, a realization forms. Perhaps the connection wasn't as one-sided as it seemed. Perhaps the person who remained wasn't merely too available, but was carrying the weight of something that required two participants. Perhaps their presence was more significant than was ever fully acknowledged. This awareness doesn't arrive with clarity. It arrives with discomfort. It is confusing and off-balance because the mind begins to see what was previously taken for granted. The silence becomes the most powerful element in the dynamic. It doesn't argue, explain, or chase. It simply exists, forcing questions without easy answers, demanding acknowledgement of emotions that can no longer be ignored. In the presence of this quiet, unexpected growth emerges. Awareness deepens, revealing the connection from a new perspective. It highlights the effort that was given, the significance of emotional distance, and the patterns that once felt normal. A psychological mirror forms, reflecting behaviors, choices, and responses, requiring honesty and acknowledgement of the roles played in the dynamic. While uncomfortable, this reflection is where transformation begins. Without this mirror, patterns repeat, cycles continue, and clarity is lost. But with it, there is potential for genuine change. The shift, though painful and confusing, carries the possibility of transformation. If faced honestly, if the silence is felt instead of avoided, if absence is understood rather than dismissed. Sometimes, the most powerful action is not in what someone does, but in what they stop doing. And sometimes, the moment someone stops chasing you is the moment you finally see them clearly. And when that clarity finally begins to settle in, something even deeper starts to unfold. It's no longer just about the silence or the distance. It becomes about what that silence is revealing. When someone who once gave constant emotional access steps back, they don't simply disappear. They leave behind a reflection, a mirror that exposes parts of yourself you may have never been forced to face before. At first, that mirror feels uncomfortable. You might try to avoid it, distract yourself, tell yourself it doesn't matter, that it's just a phase, that they'll come back the same way they always have. But this time, something feels different. The energy behind their absence isn't chaotic, reactive, or driven by hurt. It's calm, grounded, final in a way that doesn't need to announce itself. That's what makes the mirror impossible to ignore. It doesn't reflect their emotions back to you, it reflects your own. It brings up the moments you pulled away when things got too close, the times you kept your distance when they leaned in, the moments you told yourself that space was safer than connection. Suddenly, those choices no longer feel justified. They start to feel like missed opportunities, silent decisions that shape the dynamic in ways you didn't fully understand at the time. And this is where the emotional weight begins to shift. It's no longer just about losing someone's presence. It's about realizing what that presence meant. It's about seeing the consistency, the patience, the depth that was right in front of you and recognizing it only after it's no longer offered the same way. That realization carries a heaviness. It can create a pull, a desire to reconnect, to reach out, to restore what feels like it's slipping away. Often, this is when people come back, not always because they've grown, not always because they've done the deeper work, but because they feel the absence in a way they didn't anticipate. What was once familiar is now gone, and that absence sparks curiosity, questions, and a need to understand why the dynamic has shifted so drastically. But coming back is not the same as growth. Returning to something comfortable doesn't guarantee the ability to treat it differently. It often just means discomfort with the silence, with the loss of control, with the feeling of not being chosen as before. That distinction matters. From the outside, it can look like clarity or change, but underneath, the same patterns may persist. The same fears, emotional blocks, and instinct to pull away when things get real. This is where the dynamic becomes complex. An internal conflict emerges. The desire for connection, recognition of what was lost, awareness of what the other person offered, clashes with fear, protection, and discomfort with emotional closeness. These opposing forces create a push-pull within the mind, a back and forth between moving closer and retreating. To the person on the receiving end, it can feel like nothing has changed. Because in many ways it hasn't, not yet. Real change doesn't come from discomfort alone. It comes from awareness paired with action, from choosing to face patterns instead of repeating them. That process demands time, effort, and honesty that not everyone is prepared for. This is why the person who detached no longer reacts as they once did. They've already undergone their internal shift. They've confronted emotional exhaustion, sat with questions and confusion, and realized that continuing the same cycle would yield the same result. Their step back is not temporary or strategic. It is a decision grounded in clarity, a choice to stop participating in something that no longer aligns with who they have become. This is why their energy feels so different. They no longer prove their worth through giving, measure connections by endurance, or react to every fluctuation and inconsistency. Instead, they observe, feel without chasing, care without overextending, and remain open only to what meets them at the same level. That level of emotional control and self-awareness transforms the dynamic. It no longer rests on imbalance or one-sided giving. The old patterns cannot survive. To an outside observer, it may appear that the person who once cared most suddenly cares least, but the truth is they have stopped abandoning themselves. They no longer pour into something that doesn't pour back. They no longer chase a connection that should have always been mutual. In stepping into self-respect, they reach a level of emotional clarity that cannot be manipulated. Their energy is independent, calm, and grounded, not reactive or fear-driven, and it exists without dependence on anyone else's behavior. This shift is permanent. Even if attempts to reconnect occur, even if familiarity returns briefly, something fundamental has changed. The way they see themselves, experience connection, respond to inconsistency, and choose what they allow into their life. Once someone recognizes their worth on this level, they do not unlearn it. They do not settle, chase, or give endlessly without reciprocity. Their silence feels final not because they no longer feel, but because they now feel everything clearly. They have chosen peace over confusion, alignment over attachment, and themselves over a dynamic that demanded they diminish who they truly are. This clarity brings a quiet power, a self-respect that stands confidently without validation, that exists independently, and that shifts the energy of any connection irreversibly. It is the point where attachment is replaced by awareness, where giving without reciprocity is replaced by presence with discernment, and where emotional freedom is claimed as a choice choice rather than a reaction. And in that choice, something remarkable happens. It's subtle, almost invisible to the casual observer, yet it changes everything. The energy that once revolved around longing, chasing, and trying to bridge a gap is no longer present. There's a calm authority now, a quiet power that doesn't need to assert itself through words or gestures. And for anyone who has experienced the push-pull of this connection, it hits harder than anything before, because they realize too late that the one who once gave endlessly is no longer available in the same way. And this is where the truth becomes crystal clear. Detachment isn't absence of love. It's the ultimate form of self-awareness and self-preservation. It's saying, I can love deeply, but I will not lose myself in the process. From the perspective of the one who is used to receiving attention without effort, this sudden shift feels like a shockwave. Suddenly, all the control that was subtly in their hands is gone. No more chasing, no more emotional highs and lows that they could manipulate with distance. No more being able to predict or influence the reactions of someone who cared too much. Instead, there is space, silence, and an unshakable sense that the other person is no longer dependent on them. And in that moment, confusion sets in. They start questioning everything. Why didn't they come back sooner? Why aren't they reaching out? Did they ever really care, or was it all a game of endurance for them? The questions multiply because the dynamic has shifted completely, and now they are facing consequences they never expected. And it's not just about the absence of interaction, it's about the presence of boundaries. Boundaries that are firm, clear, and unwavering. Boundaries that communicate without words. Boundaries that protect self-worth. And boundaries that say, I will not compromise my peace for someone else's inconsistency. And for someone who has thrived in the push-pull cycle, this is deeply destabilizing. It challenges the sense of control and triggers the internal conflict they've been avoiding for years. Because for the first time, the dynamic is no longer dictated by their comfort. Instead, it is dictated by a newfound awareness, self-respect, and emotional maturity that cannot be manipulated or bypassed. And as this shift settles, the person who once operated from detachment within their own fear begins to confront their patterns. They realize that their avoidance wasn't harmless, that their emotional withdrawal affected someone who gave fully without hesitation, that the connection they took for granted had depth they didn't understand until it was no longer accessible. And in that reflection, something unexpected happens. They feel vulnerability, discomfort, and longing, but it's paired with fear. Fear of being faced with someone who will no longer bend to their avoidance. They now face the reality that emotional depth is not a tool to exploit. It is a presence that must be met with equal awareness and care. And yet, in all of this, the person who is detached is not cold or indifferent. They are present in the way someone is who has seen everything, felt everything, and chosen a path that protects themselves first. They are no longer caught in cycles of reactive behavior. They no longer need validation. They are free from the emotional burden of being responsible for someone else's comfort. Their energy is balanced, their love is measured, and their detachment is not a punishment. It is the natural consequence of having loved fully and wisely. And for those who watch from the outside, it can feel like loss. For those who once thrived on control, it can feel like defeat. But the truth is deeper. Detachment in this context is the most authentic demonstration of power and love combined. Because love that allows oneself to be diminished is not love, it is compromise. Love that insists on mutual respect, awareness, and emotional alignment is real. And that is what creates an unshakable presence, one that cannot be taken for granted, one that leaves a mark long after silence has settled in. And this is the ultimate awakening for the one who remains detached. They understand that their value is not tied to another's reaction. They understand that love does not require chasing. They understand that self-worth is a choice, not a negotiation. And in that understanding, understanding they become magnetic, not because they seek validation, but because they embody a clarity and calm confidence that cannot be ignored. And for the one who was used to their presence, this magnetism is almost unbearable. They realize that absence can teach more than presence ever did. That detachment, when rooted in self-awareness, creates a reflection so profound that it forces recognition, self-reflection, and sometimes regret. And in the end, the lesson is simple yet profound. Emotional availability has limits. Empathy has boundaries. Love has standards. And when someone chooses themselves after giving endlessly, the shift is both subtle and seismic. It quietly breaks patterns, disarms avoidance, and redefines the connection in ways that cannot be undone. It is not revenge. It is not manipulation. It is truth, the lived truth of someone who has loved, learned, and finally prioritized themselves over patterns that no longer serve growth. And that is why avoidance cannot handle super-empath detachment. It's not because the love was ever insufficient. It's not because they weren't cared for. It's because the power of awareness, the weight of emotional clarity, and the magnetic presence of someone who no longer chases is something they were never prepared to meet. It exposes every avoidance, every fear, every inconsistency. It forces reflection, it challenges identity, and it awakens emotions that were long buried under control and distance. And for someone who thrives on detachment as a shield, facing someone who has chosen themselves fully and calmly is destabilizing beyond measure. And this is the final truth. The moment someone stops chasing, the dynamic flips entirely. The energy no longer belongs to the one who withdraws, but to the one who stayed emotionally honest with themselves. The connection may linger, the patterns may echo, but the balance has irrevocably shifted. And in that shift, the silent message is loud and clear. You cannot control what has grown beyond your reach. You cannot manipulate someone who has learned the power of their own presence. And you cannot ignore the reality that love, when matched with self-respect, becomes unshakable and unforgettable.